In the flickering glow of gas lamps across 19th-century European exhibition halls, crowds gathered, not for art, not for scientific marvels, but to gape at a human being treated like a sideshow attraction. They weren't there to learn or to empathize. They came to stare, to point, to indulge their darkest curiosities about a young woman whose only crime was being born in a body that didn't fit the narrow ideals of European beauty and humanity. This is the story of Sarah Baartman, a tale that isn't just about personal tragedy, but a brutal indictment of how science, entertainment, and deep-seated racism can intersect to strip a human being of her dignity. What happened to Sarah is one of history's most horrifying examples of exploitation. Her body became a spectacle, her identity erased. Her suffering was paraded for profit, justified by twisted interpretations of science and public amusement. Her life and her death force us to confront an ugly truth: that entire societies once legitimized the dehumanization of black bodies in the name of curiosity, entertainment, and inquiry. And if we're honest, the echoes of that cruelty still linger today. Let's rewind to the early 1800s, a time when European colonial empires were at their peak. With imperial expansion came a growing obsession with the exotic, the primitive. And feeding that obsession was a dangerous pseudoscience, what we now call scientific racism. It was gaining traction in universities and among public intellectuals, as researchers scrambled to categorize human beings by race, with the not-so-subtle goal of placing white Europeans at the top of the so-called evolutionary ladder. This was also the era of human zoos. Yes, actual human beings were kidnapped, shipped to Europe, and put on display for public amusement. Indigenous peoples from Africa, Asia, and the Americas were exhibited like animals in cages, as if their mere existence were something strange, something lesser, something to be studied or laughed at. The line between science and spectacle? It had completely vanished. Africa, to the European imagination, wasn't a vast and complex continent filled with rich cultures and civilizations. It was viewed as a savage wilderness, populated by people seen as something between human and beast. And among these so-called curiosities, the Khoikhoi people of South Africa stood out. With their distinct physical features, traditional customs, and unfamiliar language, they became easy targets for anthropologists, showmen, and colonial entrepreneurs. Now picture Cape Town at the time, a volatile crossroads of cultures. The Dutch had established colonial dominance there, paving the way for what would later become the formal apartheid system. For the Khoikhoi, European colonization meant disaster, stolen land, violent repression, and disease that decimated their population. Communities that had existed for generations were shattered. Many were forced into labor. That's the world into which Sarah Baartman, born Sahura or Sarch, entered. She was born around 1789 in the Gamtoos Valley, in South Africa's Eastern Cape. Her early life, spent among her people, was brutally disrupted by colonial violence. Her father was killed in a Dutch commando raid, just one part of the broader campaign to seize land and cattle from the Khoikhoi. Like many women in her situation, Sarah was forced into servitude. She ended up working for a Dutch farmer near Cape Town named Peter Caesar. And that's where her life took a fateful turn. It's unclear exactly how Sarah was convinced or coerced into leaving South Africa. What we do know is that two men were involved: Hendrik Caesar, possibly a relative of her employer, and Alexander Dunlop, a British naval doctor. They told her she could make money, gain fame, and start a new life as a performer in Europe. Imagine the promise that held for someone trapped in servitude, with little control over her future. But whether Sarah ever truly consented to the journey is murky at best. The power dynamics were so heavily skewed, the question of choice becomes almost impossible to answer. What's clear is that she boarded a ship to London in 1810, and whatever hopes she had were soon crushed. Sarah had a genetic trait known as steatopegia, a natural condition common among Khoikhoi women, involving the accumulation of fat on the buttocks. To European audiences unfamiliar with and often hostile to anything outside their norms, this was seen as bizarre, even grotesque. Combine that with elongated labia, another trait found among some Khoikhoi women, and Sarah's body became the perfect subject for European projection. Racial fears, sexual fantasies, and pseudo-scientific obsession all wrapped into one. She arrived in London and was immediately put on display at 225 Piccadilly Street. The promotional materials pulled no punches. They called her the Hottentot Venus, a title that was both a racial slur and a cruel mockery of the Roman goddess of love. For 2 shillings, visitors could enter a small room where Sarah stood on a platform. She wore tight, skin-colored clothing designed to exaggerate her figure while technically maintaining decency. It was all part of the act. And make no mistake, this was an act, but not one she wrote or controlled. She was told how to move, how to stand, how to behave. She had to walk back and forth, turn around, even let audience members touch her. Her body, her very existence was for sale. And every movement she made reinforced the lie of her own inferiority. Sometimes she wore traditional Khoikhoi dress. Other times, face paint and beads. Always a performance, always a spectacle. Crafted to reassure her white audience of their own civilization by contrasting it with what they saw as savagery. Eyewitnesses described the horror of these shows, spectators reaching out to grope her, jeering, laughing. She was told to sing in her native tongue, not to celebrate her culture, but to present it as strange and alien. Behind her stood her handlers, often explaining her abnormalities in the language of racial science. Her body was a living argument in favor of white supremacy, and yet, even in 1810, not everyone was okay with this. Britain's abolitionist movement, already active in fighting the slave trade, took notice. The African Association, a key anti-slavery group, brought a legal case, arguing that Sarah was essentially being held against her will and subjected to sexualized abuse. The case became a media sensation, but legal systems in the 19th century weren't built to protect black women, especially not ones like Sarah, who had no wealth, no family, and no standing in British society. She was coached to say she was a willing participant, that she was paid, that she could leave at any time. It's hard to imagine the pressure she must have been under during that testimony. The court took her words at face value and closed the case. Just like that, the law washed its hands of her. The exploitation could continue, now officially consensual. But her so-called freedom? That was just part of the show. After the dust settled in London, Sarah's handlers knew the British public was beginning to grow uneasy. The court case hadn't shut down the show, but the controversy had made them cautious. So they packed up and took Sarah to where audiences were more willing, more ruthless even, in their pursuit of so-called entertainment. In 1814, she was brought to Paris, the city that prided itself as the heart of enlightenment and high culture. But if London had been cruel, Paris would be something far worse. In Paris, Sarah ended up under the control of a man named Réau, a showman who made his living exhibiting animals. He displayed her alongside trained monkeys and bears, further stripping away her humanity. She was no longer even a person in the eyes of the crowd, just another creature in his grotesque menagerie. The performances in Paris were even more degrading than those in London. Sarah was made to wear only a small apron that barely covered her genitals. She was often nearly naked, her body put on display for large crowds eager to see the Hottentot Venus. The French public flocked to see her, more curious, more obsessed, more voyeuristic than even the Londoners. She performed in all kinds of venues, from high society salons filled with aristocrats and scholars to dingy sideshows in working-class neighborhoods. Her body became the subject of endless scrutiny by everyone from laughing children to so-called scientists. Among those scientists was Georges Cuvier, one of France's most famous naturalists. He was a founding figure in the field of comparative anatomy, and, as history would prove, a man whose work helped lay the foundations for scientific racism. Cuvier and his colleagues didn't see Sarah as a person. They saw her as a specimen, an object to be dissected, studied, and used to reinforce the racial hierarchies they believed in. He conducted multiple examinations of her while she was alive, taking notes, sketches, and measurements. He wasn't interested in who she was, only what her body could tell him about the supposed inferiority of her race. Imagine living under that constant gaze. Sarah, once promised a life of opportunity, now existed as little more than a living artifact, paraded, prodded, measured, and judged. And slowly, it began to take its toll. The humiliation, the exploitation, the physical stress, and the emotional trauma began to wear her down. Contemporary reports say she began to drink heavily, likely one of the only forms of escape available to her. Her performances became dull, automatic. The spark in her eyes faded. She grew quiet, withdrawn. It became clear that there would be no escape, no triumphant return to her homeland, no salvation. By the end of 1815, Sarah's health had sharply declined. Years of being paraded as a spectacle, subjected to public degradation, and denied her basic humanity had left her body broken. On December 29, 1815, at the age of just 26, she died. Some reports list pneumonia or tuberculosis as the cause, but really she died of neglect, of cruelty, of Europe's unrelenting appetite to consume her. But even in death, Sarah was not allowed peace. Within hours of her passing, Georges Cuvier claimed her body in the name of science. He performed an autopsy, not one guided by medical compassion, but by the same voyeuristic obsession that had defined her entire time in Europe. He removed her brain and her genitals, preserving them in jars of formaldehyde. He had a full plaster cast made of her body. Her skeleton was meticulously prepared for display. The violation she endured in life continued, even intensified, in death. Cuvier's report to the French Academy of Sciences is now widely recognized as one of the most disgraceful documents in the history of anthropology. He described Sarah's body in obscene detail, comparing her features to those of apes. He claimed that she was a link between humans and animals. He dwelled at length on her genitalia, using his scientific authority to reinforce the grotesque racial myths that had already justified centuries of slavery and colonization. His conclusions weren't just offensive, they were dangerous. They became part of the academic canon, reinforcing ideas about African inferiority that would echo for generations. And Sarah's remains? They weren't respectfully buried. They were displayed at the Musée de l'Homme in Paris for over 150 years. Her skeleton stood mounted for public viewing. Her preserved organs, her brain, her genitalia, sat in jars, seen by thousands of museum-goers. She was not a person. She was an example, a data point, an object in a cabinet of curiosities. Even after death, Sarah Baartman was denied the dignity afforded to most human beings. And during that time, decade after decade, no one thought to ask whether this was wrong. Academics wrote papers about her anatomy. Visitors gawked at her bones. Institutions profited from her suffering. No one stopped to ask who she had been, what she had felt, what she had wanted. She had been reduced to what her exploiters had always wanted her to be. Not a woman, not a person, but a symbol, a grotesque trophy of scientific colonialism. The story might have ended there, forgotten in the back halls of a museum, but Sarah's legacy refused to stay buried. In the 1980s, as South Africa's anti-apartheid movement gained international momentum, activists and scholars began calling for the return of Sarah Baartman's remains. They saw her not just as a tragic figure, but as a powerful symbol of colonial violence and of the way that racism had been dressed up as knowledge. Poets wrote about her. Protesters marched in her name. Historians exposed the truth of what had been done to her. The call was clear. Sarah must come home. The French scientific establishment pushed back. They argued that Sarah's remains were valuable scientific artifacts, part of humanity's shared heritage. It was the same logic that had once justified her exploitation in the first place, that her body belonged not to her or to her people, but to the world. But the tide was turning. After years of pressure and negotiation, through diplomacy, protests, and public campaigns, France finally agreed. And in 2002, nearly 2 centuries after she had been taken from her homeland, Sarah Baartman's remains were returned to South Africa. She was given a state funeral, attended by thousands. Her story had become known around the world. People came not just to mourn her, but to celebrate her. Her resilience, her humanity, her legacy. She was buried in the Eastern Cape, near the land where she had been born. And for the first time in over 200 years, she was no longer on display. But even though Sarah Baartman was finally laid to rest, her story didn't end there. In many ways, it was just beginning, because her life, her suffering, and her memory had become part of something bigger, a reckoning with how the world treats black bodies, especially the bodies of black women. Sarah's exploitation didn't just reinforce racial stereotypes, it helped create them. The way she was displayed, described, and dissected gave shape to long-standing myths about black women, that their bodies are somehow inherently sexual, primitive, different. These ideas didn't disappear when the museums took her bones off display. They sank deeper, finding new life in modern culture, from advertising and film to pornography and fashion. The image of the exotic black woman, available for consumption, still circulates today. It shows up in the way media portrays black femininity, in the language of beauty standards, in the assumptions made about black women's behavior and worth. The legacy of Sarah's public humiliation is still with us, not as a memory, but as a system. And the damage wasn't just cultural, it was institutional. Cuvier's so-called scientific study of Sarah Baartman helped lay the intellectual groundwork for generations of colonial violence. His measurements and conclusions were used to justify slavery, segregation, apartheid. They were cited as proof that African peoples were biologically inferior. His work fed into eugenics movements, racist immigration laws, and education systems that taught white supremacy as fact. Sarah's body, in life and in death, had been turned into a weapon against her own people. But with her return to South Africa, her story began to shift from objectification to reclamation. Her name was spoken with reverence. Her life was studied not to examine her body, but to honor her voice. Writers, artists, and educators began to use her story as a lens to explore broader issues of racism, colonialism, and sexism. South African poets wrote verses imagining her thoughts and dreams. Painters created portraits that restored her dignity. Museums re-examined their practices. Anthropologists and historians apologized for the discipline's role in her exploitation. In every field touched by her story, change began to ripple. And it didn't stop there. Sarah's case became a precedent for repatriation efforts across the globe. Indigenous communities in Australia, North America, and South America began demanding the return of ancestors held in European museums. Her story fueled the movement to rethink the ethics of human remains, colonial collections, and institutional memory. The question her life raised, who owns a body, echoed far beyond anthropology. It touched debates in medical ethics, museum studies, human rights law. Activists began pushing for stricter laws around consent, bodily autonomy, and the treatment of human subjects. Universities that once celebrated scientists like Cuvier started teaching his work as a warning, not a triumph. In South Africa, Sarah Baartman's story became part of the national curriculum. Students learn about her not just as a victim, but as a symbol of resistance. They study how her life illustrates the intersection of racism, sexism, and pseudoscience. And in learning about her, they learn to question systems of power, to recognize the subtle ways that dehumanization still operates. Some scholars argue that Sarah's exploitation reveals something deeply disturbing about modernity itself, that the very systems we built to pursue knowledge and progress have always had a dark side. That curiosity, when untethered from ethics, can become cruelty. That the line between studying and consuming is thinner than we'd like to believe. And those lessons feel more relevant than ever. Today, the internet makes it possible for stories like Sarah's to be shared widely. But it also creates new risks. Old images of her can be circulated without context, turning her suffering into content. Digital platforms can strip nuance from her story, reducing her again to spectacle. That's why educators and activists are working so hard to frame her story responsibly, to tell it in ways that honor her humanity, rather than sensationalizing her pain. It's not enough to remember Sarah Baartman. We have to remember her right. And remembering her isn't just about telling her story. It's about how we tell it. Who gets to speak? Who gets to profit? Who decides what her legacy means? These are hard questions, but they matter. Because every time we speak her name, we're shaping her memory. In museums that once displayed her skeleton, the empty cases are now powerful reminders. They don't just represent what's been returned, they represent what was taken. They force us to confront the violence behind so much of what we once called science or education. Even the simple act of calling her by her real name, Asahura, is powerful. It's a way of reclaiming her story from the people who renamed her, repackaged her, and sold her body to the highest bidder. Saying her name is a quiet revolution. It insists she was more than what they did to her. Legal scholars now cite her case when talking about bodily rights, especially for marginalized people. They examine how consent can be manipulated in systems built on power imbalance. Medical students study her exploitation to understand what it means to truly treat patients with dignity. Activists use her image to challenge the ongoing commodification of women's bodies, whether in advertising, entertainment, or labor. Her grave in the Eastern Cape has become a place of pilgrimage. Visitors leave flowers. Children leave drawings. Letters are tucked into the soil. These small acts of tenderness stand in stark contrast to the cruelty she experienced in life. They whisper, "You were more than your suffering." Today, Sarah Baartman's story is told in classrooms, courtrooms, art galleries, and online. It's been woven into discussions about feminism, racial justice, reparations, and the ethics of science. And with every retelling, we're asked to face the same question. When you see someone being treated as less than human, what will you do? Her story teaches us that it's not enough to look back in horror. We have to look forward with intention. Her life asks us not just to remember her, but to do better. To build systems that honor dignity. To reject curiosity without compassion. To resist every attempt to turn people into objects. Because Sarah Baartman is not just a name in a history book. She's a mirror. She shows us the worst we are capable of and the best we can aspire to be. And so, when we speak her name now, it is not in mockery or spectacle. It is in reverence, in defiance, in mourning, and in hope. May her memory be not just a lesson, but a call to action. May she rest in the peace she was denied in life. And may we build a world where no one's body is ever again put on display, except by choice, and never for sale. That is the justice Sarah Baartman deserves. That is the world her memory demands.